Story number 1. The Knock at the Door. It was a quiet night in the small suburban neighborhood, the kind of night that seemed to hold its breath. Everything still and dark, save for the occasional hum of a passing car or the soft rustling of tree branches in the wind. Jack Miller sat alone in his living room, the flickering light from the TV casting long shadows across the walls. He wasn't watching anything in particular, just flipping through channels, barely aware of the noise. His wife, Linda, had gone out for the evening, and their 2 kids were spending the night at their grandmother's house. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Jack's hand froze over the remote, his heart beating a little faster than it should have. He hadn't been expecting anyone. The knock came again, gentle but insistent. He glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. Who could it be at this hour? He stood slowly, his feet heavy on the hardwood floor as he moved toward the door. There was something about the late hour that made him uneasy, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was just the isolation of the house, the emptiness that felt too quiet. When he opened the door, 2 children stood on the porch. They were dressed in thick coats, their hoods pulled low over their heads, obscuring most of their faces. The night was cold, but they didn't shiver. They stood perfectly still, silent as stone. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "Hello?" he said, his voice sounding too loud in the still night. The children didn't respond right away. Their eyes were black, deep, empty black, like the night itself. There was no shimmer of light in them, no reflection, just darkness. They didn't blink, not once. The girl, the smaller of the 2, looked up at him. Her pale face was almost too white in the darkness. "We're lost," she said, her voice soft, almost sweet. "Can we come inside?" "Please?" The boy, a little older, stood slightly behind her, his expression unreadable. His hand gripped the girl's shoulder, but neither of them moved. Their feet didn't shuffle. They just stood. Jack felt a strange pull, an irresistible urge to step aside and let them in. It was as if the air around him was suddenly heavy with their presence, pushing him toward the door. His hand shook slightly as it hovered above the handle, the words coming out of his mouth before he even realized he was speaking. "Of course, you must be cold. Come inside." But the moment he said it, a flicker of doubt flashed through his mind. He froze, the words tasting wrong, as though they hadn't come from him at all. Something in his gut twisted, a warning that he couldn't ignore. His gaze darted from the children's black eyes to the empty street beyond. The streetlights cast long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him, as if the night itself was watching. The little girl took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was sharp, like she knew something he didn't, and then, almost imperceptibly, the boy moved too. That was when Jack realized he didn't want to let them in, not anymore. Something wasn't right. He backed away from the door, heart hammering. I'm sorry. You should go home. It's not safe out here." But the children didn't seem to hear him. The girl's smile faded into something colder, something far older than her small, pale face should have known. "You don't want to let us in," she said, her voice still soft, but now laced with something dark. "But you will." Jack's blood ran cold, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. His legs shook, his mouth dry. The door felt miles away. The boy's hand reached out toward him, long and thin, fingers extending like branches. Jack slammed the door shut. He stood there, his back pressed against the wood, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. He heard them on the other side of the door, soft whispers, muffled and unintelligible, like a chant. The knock came again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Jack didn't move. He couldn't move. Something had changed in the house. An oppressive weight in the air that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He could still hear their whispers, growing louder, echoing through the door, and then, as if a switch had been flipped, everything went silent. Jack held his breath, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound. But there was nothing. He slowly turned around and walked toward the living room, each step dragging him further into a nightmare he didn't understand. The lights flickered once and then stayed dark. From behind him, a voice, soft, cold, and clear, spoke in his ear. "You let us in, Jack." The breath caught in his throat. He turned quickly, his pulse racing, but there was no one there. And yet, in the stillness of the house, Jack could swear he felt the cold weight of those black eyes upon him. He wasn't alone. Story not anymore. Number 2. The roadside encounter. The car hummed steadily along the dark, empty highway, its headlights cutting through the night like a knife. The roads had been empty for hours, just a long stretch of asphalt bordered by nothing but fields and trees that seemed to close in with each passing mile. The Taylor family was on a road trip, trying to make it to their next destination before sunrise. But as the clock ticked past midnight, their energy began to fade. "I think we should pull over for a bit," said Mark, glancing at his wife, Karen, in the passenger seat. "We've been driving for hours. The kids are asleep. We might as well take a break." Karen nodded, her eyes heavy with fatigue. "Yeah, I could use a rest." Mark spotted a small gravel pull-off up ahead. The area was deserted. No signs of life, no other cars, just a stretch of lonely highway flanked by dark woods. He pulled the car over and switched off the engine. The quiet outside was almost oppressive, too still for such a late hour. The kids, Emma and Jake, were both sound asleep in the back seat, wrapped in their blankets. Mark and Karen sat in silence for a few moments, both staring out through the windshield at the dark landscape. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the fields and the tree line. "Do you think we'll make it by morning?" Karen asked, her voice soft. "Maybe. It's a long stretch, but we'll be fine." Mark rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the weariness. And then, a soft tapping on the window broke the silence. Mark jumped, his heart pounding. He turned quickly to see a pair of children standing outside the car, 2 small figures, their faces pale and drawn in the moonlight. At first, he thought they were just a trick of the light, or perhaps his tired eyes playing tricks on him. But no, they were real, standing in the gravel next to the car, silent as ghosts. Karen gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. Where did they come from? Mark blinked, his mind racing. I don't know, they just appeared. The children were dressed strangely, in old-fashioned clothes that seemed out of place for this time of year. Tattered coats, faded dresses, shoes that looked too big for their small feet. They stood there motionless, just staring at the car with dark, empty eyes. Mark slowly rolled down the window, trying to ignore the chill creeping in. "Can we help you?" The boy, a little older than his sister, spoke first. His voice was soft, almost like a whisper. "We need a ride, please, we're lost." The girl, who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, looked up at Mark with those black eyes. No whites, no irises, just pure, deep black. Her gaze felt like it was seeping into him, draining something vital from his body. He could feel the cold rushing in, as if the air around them had suddenly dropped several degrees. Mark's heart raced. "Where are you headed?" he asked, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he already knew the answer. "To our home," the boy said, his voice hollow. "We're far from home." Mark hesitated. Something about their voices, something about the way they stood, made him uneasy. "It's really late. You should be careful out here." "We've been waiting for so long," the girl said, her voice echoing slightly as if it wasn't quite real. "Please, we need to go home." The air around them grew colder, almost freezing, and Mark could feel his breath fogging up in front of him, despite the warmth inside the car. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. "Mark," Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't like this. We need to go." But the boy stepped closer to the window, his black eyes locked on Mark's. "Please, you don't understand. We can't stay here. You have to take us home." Mark swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. The girl took a step forward as well, her eyes fixed on him, unblinking. Her face was too pale, too still. The world seemed to grow quieter. The distant sound of wind rustling in the trees vanished, and the hum of the car's engine seemed far away. All Mark could hear was the cold, empty weight of those black eyes. He glanced over at Karen, who was staring at the children with wide eyes, her face pale. Her lips trembled, but she didn't say anything. "We don't know where your home is," Mark said, his voice strained. "And I think you should go. You shouldn't be out here alone." The children didn't respond immediately. Instead, they stared at him, their faces unreadable. It felt like hours had passed in the space of a few seconds. Mark's skin crawled, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Then the boy spoke again. "It's not far, but you won't make it back." Mark's blood ran cold. The girl raised her hand and placed it gently on the window. "You'll come with us now," she said, her voice softer, like a lullaby. Mark's stomach twisted in a knot. He didn't know what he was feeling. Fear, confusion, a rising sense of dread that had nowhere to go. He glanced at Karen again, then at the back seat, where the kids were still sleeping, oblivious to the strangers outside. "We don't have time for this," Karen whispered. "Let's go, please, let's go now." Without thinking, Mark slammed his foot on the gas. The car shot forward, tires screeching on the gravel, and the children were left behind, standing still in the rearview mirror as the car sped away. The road stretched ahead of them, dark and endless, but the tension didn't ease. The cold lingered in the air, seeping into the car, and the silence between them felt like something pressing down from above. And then, just as Mark was about to let out a sigh of relief, a whisper came from the back seat. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, his voice small and sleepy. Mark's heart stopped. He turned around slowly, his eyes locking with Karen's, as the truth hung in the air, heavy and impossible. The kids were still asleep, weren't they? Story number 3. The Stranger in the Diner. It had been a long day on the road, the kind that wore you down like a slow grind mile after mile. Rick Harmon had been driving his rig for what felt like days. His eyes were heavy, his back sore from hours of sitting in the same position. His stomach growled as the headlights of his truck cut through the endless stretch of highway. He needed a break, some hot food, a cup of coffee, and maybe a few minutes of peace before hitting the road again. He spotted the diner up ahead, a small rundown building with a neon sign buzzing faintly, its flicker the only sign of life in the otherwise empty stretch of highway. The kind of place you'd only stop at if you had nowhere else to go, but Rick didn't care. He was hungry, and it looked like the only place open for miles. He parked his truck outside, the gravel crunching under his tires, and stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin. The diner looked just as tired as he felt, old-fashioned, with peeling paint and dusty windows. But it had a certain charm, like it had been here forever, weathering storms and time alike. Rick pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling. The smell of frying bacon and coffee hit him instantly, along with the warmth that radiated from the dimly lit interior. It was nearly empty, Just a few scattered booths, a couple of chairs at the counter. The lone waitress, a woman in her 40s with a tired face, looked up from behind the counter. "Hey there," she said with a soft, worn smile. "You need a seat?" Rick nodded and slid into a booth in the far corner. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator in the back was the only sound, except for the soft clink of silverware. The waitress shuffled over, pouring him a cup of coffee before taking his order. "You want something to eat?" she asked, her voice a little too flat. "Just a burger, whatever's easiest," Rick said, running a hand through his graying hair. "Coming right up," she replied, and turned away. Rick took a sip of the coffee, wincing at the bitterness. As his eyes scanned the diner, something caught his attention. In the corner booth, 2 children were sitting, barely noticeable at first. They were almost too still, too quiet. A boy and a girl, maybe 8 or 9, sitting side by side, their faces hidden behind their long hair. But what struck Rick immediately were their eyes. He couldn't see their pupils, just a deep black void, empty and endless. The kind of eyes that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He tried to shake it off. Maybe they were just kids, tired from a long road trip with their parents. But there was something about the way they were sitting, their heads tilted in his direction, staring at him without a single word. It made his skin crawl. The more he tried to ignore them, the more he felt their gaze like a weight on his chest. The boy's eyes locked onto his with a coldness that went beyond just staring. It was like the child was studying him, like he knew something Rick didn't. Rick shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to focus on the cup of coffee in his hands. But the silence was growing heavier, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. The waitress returned with his burger, setting it down in front of him without saying a word. She didn't even glance at the kids in the corner. Rick didn't want to look at them. He didn't want to acknowledge that strange, suffocating presence in the corner of the diner. But his eyes kept wandering back. The children hadn't moved. They were still staring at him, their black eyes glistening in the dim light, their faces pale and drawn. They looked wrong. Too perfect, too still. Rick took a bite of his burger, but it tasted like sawdust in his mouth. His stomach churned uneasily. His hand went to his pocket, and he fumbled for his wallet. He needed to pay, get out of here, get back on the road. But when he pulled out his wallet, he noticed something strange. The picture inside, one of him and his wife, was gone. There was just an empty space where it used to be. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't taken it out. Had he lost it? He searched through the wallet again, his fingers trembling, but the picture was nowhere to be found. His mind raced, the kids, the picture. He felt it, that creeping sense of something wrong, something much darker than he could explain. The boy in the corner leaned forward slightly, just enough for Rick to catch his gaze. The black eyes glimmered, and the boy's lips curled into a thin, unsettling smile. "You're here now," the boy said, his voice cold and emotionless. Rick's breath caught in his throat. His mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" he managed to whisper. The girl, who had been eerily quiet until then, spoke without looking up from her hands. "You've been waiting for us." A shiver ran down Rick's spine. He didn't understand what they meant, but he didn't need to. He felt it, deep in his gut, that instinctive sense that everything about this place, about these kids, was wrong. He stood up abruptly, tossing some money onto the table. He didn't wait for the waitress to say anything. He didn't look at the kids again. He turned and rushed for the door, his boots clattering against the floor. As he stepped outside, the chill of the night air hit him like a slap. He hurried to his truck, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he turned the key in the ignition and pulled out onto the highway, he couldn't shake the feeling that the children were still watching him, their black eyes following him into the night. And he couldn't shake the certainty that they had been waiting for him. Story number 4. The Visitor. Samantha had lived in her little cottage on the edge of town for nearly 3 years, and in all that time, she had never felt truly alone. She liked it that way, the quiet, the solitude. It was her refuge. She had a steady job at the local library, a few friends who dropped by now and then, and that was enough. She didn't need much. The world outside was loud enough, and sometimes being by herself was all she really wanted. But lately, something had changed. It wasn't anything big, not at first, just small things. A creaking floorboard when she knew she was the only one upstairs. A cold spot in the hallway that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Little things that, by themselves, were easily explained away. At first, she chalked it up to her imagination. The house was old, after all, and the wind could make all kinds of sounds. But as the weeks went on, the noises grew harder to ignore. Scratching at the window in the dead of night. Low, whispered voices when no one else was there. A thudding sound, like something, or someone, was tapping gently on the walls. It wasn't until one evening, when the shadows outside stretched long and dark, that she saw them. Samantha had just settled into bed, the soft hum of her bedside lamp the only light in the room. Her eyelids were heavy, and her mind was drifting towards sleep when a noise broke through the quiet. It was a soft tapping, like fingers on glass, barely audible, but enough to make her pause. She sat up in bed, heart thumping in her chest. The tapping came again, this time louder. She swung her legs out from under the covers, her bare feet touching the cool floor. Slowly, she crept toward the window. Her breath caught in her throat. 2 figures were standing outside, just beyond the glass. At first, she thought they were children, small, hunched figures that seemed to be peering into her room. But it wasn't just the sight of them that made her blood run cold. It was their eyes. Black, empty, unblinking. They were staring directly at her, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes wide and void of any color. Samantha's pulse quickened. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the window, pressing her back against the wall. She had lived alone long enough to know the feeling of being watched, but this was different. This was something else. Something cold, something wrong. Her mind raced. She knew she should call someone, anyone, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the children outside. They didn't move. They didn't blink. Their eyes were fixed on her with a kind of intensity that made her feel like they were peeling her apart, layer by layer, without ever touching her. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with dread. Samantha swallowed hard, her throat dry. She turned toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Should she open it? Should she call for help? But the children didn't seem to want in. They only stared, their presence like a force pressing against her chest, suffocating her. She shook her head, her mind racing with fear. She wouldn't open the door, not for them, not for anything. "Leave me alone," she whispered, her voice shaking. As soon as the words left her lips, the air around her seemed to freeze. The children didn't move. They didn't speak. But in that moment she knew, deep in her gut, that they had heard her, that they were waiting for her to do something, anything. Samantha couldn't take it any longer. She backed away from the window, her legs trembling beneath her. She didn't dare take her eyes off them. Slowly, carefully, she turned toward the back of the house. The back door, she would lock it, make sure it was bolted. But just as she reached the hallway, the tapping on the window stopped. The air felt different. A sense of emptiness lingered, like the very house had exhaled a breath it didn't want to take. She hesitated, standing there in the dark. The silence that followed felt unnatural, too still. Then, without warning, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps retreating into the night. She rushed to the window again, her eyes scanning the dark yard. The children were gone. The world outside her window was silent, still. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally long, but the figures, those two pale children, were nowhere to be seen. But something had changed. Something inside her twisted with a feeling she couldn't name, but couldn't shake either. The sense that they weren't gone, that they were still there, waiting. The house felt colder now, as though a draft had swept through. The silence was unbearable, and no matter how much she tried to push it away, the fear lingered. She didn't sleep that night. The hours stretched on, and with every passing minute the terror of those black eyes gnawed at her, leaving her wide-eyed and restless in her bed. And even as the sun rose the next morning, casting its warm light over the house, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that the children hadn't left, that they never would, that they were still out there, watching, waiting for her to open the door. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. And as long as she lived in that house, Samantha knew one thing for certain. The visitor was still out there. Story number 5. The Forgotten House. The air outside was thick with the kind of humidity that made everything feel heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The group of friends stood at the edge of the old abandoned house, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light of dusk. The house loomed ahead of them, its sagging roof and broken windows like eyes watching them from the shadows. "Are you sure about this?" Jess asked, her voice wavering slightly. She was the quiet one, the one who always hesitated before diving into something reckless. "It's just a house, Jess," said Mike, grinning as he shoved his hands into the pockets of his jacket. He was the ringleader of their little group, always pushing for the next thrill. "Besides, it's not like anything's going to happen." The others laughed nervously, their faces lit by the faint glow of their flashlights. They'd heard the stories, the rumors of the cursed house, the strange disappearances, the whispers in the night. But they were all here now, standing at the broken-down doorstep, daring each other to be the first to step inside. Jess glanced at her friends, Mike, Ben, and Olivia, who were all staring at the house with varying degrees of nervous excitement. Ben, the skeptic, was already heading for the door. "This place is just old and creepy. It's not cursed. Let's just get inside and call it a night." With a shared look, they followed him inside. The door creaked as it opened, the hinges protesting in a low, groaning whisper. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling around them as they stepped across the threshold. The house smelled stale, like something had been dead here for years, but there was also a strange undercurrent of something else, something darker, something that made their skin prickle. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and the house seemed to sigh in response as if it had been waiting for them. They set up their sleeping bags in the large living room, the only area that seemed remotely safe. The other rooms were too dark, too full of mystery and fear. For a while, they joked about how creepy the place was, their laughter echoing off the walls. But as the hours dragged on, the mood shifted. The silence between them grew heavier, the air colder. Jess pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the night. "Okay, I think we've had enough," Olivia said, her voice a little too loud in the quiet. "Let's just go." Mike waved her off. "It's only midnight. We'll stay a little longer. I'll bet nothing even happens." They fell into uneasy silence, each of them thinking about how close they were to leaving, yet too afraid to admit it out loud. That's when they heard it. A knock. Soft at first, almost like the tapping of a branch against the window. But then it came again, more insistent this time. Mike's face tightened. Who the hell could be knocking at a place like this? He muttered, but there was no hiding the unease in his voice. The knock came again. Jess felt her heart begin to race. "We should check it out," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll do it," Ben said, standing up from where he sat. He looked at each of them, his eyes flicking nervously. It's probably just some kids playing a prank. But as Ben crossed the room toward the door, the others remained still, a strange sense of dread settling over them. Something was wrong. Ben opened the door. Standing on the threshold were two children. They couldn't have been older than 8 or 9, their faces pale and ghostly under the faint light from the room behind them. Their clothes were old-fashioned, ragged, as if they'd been worn for years. But it was their eyes that caught their attention. Black, empty, unblinking. Jess gasped, taking a step back. The children didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in silence, their black eyes fixed on Ben. "Can we come in?" the girl asked, her voice too soft, too cold. She didn't sound like a child. She sounded wrong. Ben froze. Who are you?" he stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. "We're lost," the boy said in a tone that made their skin crawl. "Can we come inside?" The air grew colder, a biting chill that seemed to seep into their bones. The house, once creaky and musty, now felt alive. The walls seemed to close in, and the darkness outside grew deeper, like a living thing, stretching toward them. "What the hell is going on?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "We should let them in," Mike said, though his voice was unsure. There was something about the children, something in their presence that made him feel like his thoughts weren't his own. He didn't want to open the door, but there was this urge deep inside him, like a pull he couldn't resist. Jess shook her head furiously. "No, don't let them in. We don't know who they are." But the others were already stepping aside, the door swinging open wider as if they had no choice. The moment the children stepped inside, the air grew thicker. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, stretching and writhing, like they were alive. The darkness seemed to seep into the very walls of the house, the wood groaning in protest. The children didn't move. They simply stood there, silent, staring. And then it happened. The house seemed to inhale, a deep, groaning sound, as if it was waking up after years of slumber. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker, colder, as if the house was expanding, reaching, consuming. Jess looked at her friends. Their eyes were glassy, their faces pale. They seemed hypnotized, caught in some kind of trance. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice shaking. But no one answered. They were all staring at the children. The girl smiled. It wasn't a smile, not really. It was something else, something that made Jess's stomach twist in fear. The boy stepped forward, his black eyes glistening in the dark. "You shouldn't have let us in," he whispered, his voice like cold wind. And that was when Jess understood. The house wasn't abandoned, it wasn't forgotten, it was waiting, and now was hungry. Story number 6. The bus stop. The fog hung low over the town like a thick blanket, smothering everything in its path. It was one of those mornings where the world seemed to have gone silent, muffled by the heavy mist that wrapped itself around the streets, turning everything into a blur of gray. The streetlights flickered faintly, barely visible through the fog, and the only sound was the occasional squeak of a distant car passing by. Harold Briggs stood alone at the bus stop, his coat pulled tight against the chill in the air. His hands were buried in his pockets, his breath coming out in small puffs of white smoke. He had never been a fan of mornings like this. The dampness in the air, the loneliness of the empty streets. It all felt wrong, like something was waiting for him to notice. He checked his watch for the 10th time in the last 5 minutes. The bus should have arrived by now. But of course it hadn't. There was always something off about the 6:45 route, something that made him want to avoid it. But he had no choice today. The early meeting at work meant he had to catch this bus, no matter how uneasy it made him feel. It was then that he saw them. 2 figures emerging out of the fog. At first, he thought they were just more shadows drifting in and out of the mist. But as they came closer, he realized they were children. A boy and a girl, no older than 8 or 9, walking slowly toward him. They didn't make a sound, their feet barely making any noise against the wet pavement. They moved with an odd precision, as if they had somewhere to be. Somewhere they had to be, no matter how early or how cold. Harold frowned. There were no houses around here. No reason for kids to be out at this hour. They must have been walking for some time, but they didn't seem tired, just strange. Their faces were pale, almost too pale, and their clothes looked out of place for the weather. Thin jackets that wouldn't do much against the chill. The boy stopped a few feet away from Harold and stared at him, his black eyes wide and unblinking. There was no shine in them, no glint of light, just blackness. The girl stood beside him, her eyes the same dark, hollow black. "Excuse me," the boy said in a soft, almost whispering voice. "Can we ride with you?" Harold blinked, his heart skipping a beat. He took a step back, unsettled by the way they looked at him, like they were waiting for something. Maybe it was just the fog, the way it made everything feel distant and strange, but something about these kids didn't feel right. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the discomfort that crept up his spine. No, you need to go home," Harold said, his voice a little firmer than he intended. "It's too early for kids to be out here. Go back to where you came from." The children didn't move. They didn't seem to react at all. They just kept staring at him, those black eyes unblinking, unfazed by his words. The girl spoke next, her voice soft and sweet, but cold, like the fog itself. "We need to go with you. Please, can we?" Harold took another step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. There was no reason for him to feel afraid of these kids. They were just children, right? But something about them, about their presence, sent a chill through him that he couldn't shake. "I said no," Harold snapped, a little louder now. "Go home. It's not safe out here for you." The boy's mouth twitched into something like a smile, but it didn't look like a smile at all. It was too wide, too hollow. "We have to go with you," he repeated. And this time, his voice held an edge of insistence. Harold's mind raced. He thought of turning and running, but that would only make him look foolish. He didn't want to look foolish, not in front of these kids. But the longer he stood there, the more he felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, like something was wrong in the air. The sound of the bus rumbled faintly in the distance. Harold glanced down the street, relieved to see the headlights pushing through the fog. Finally, the bus was on its way. He turned back to the children, ready to ignore them, but they hadn't moved. They were still standing there, as if waiting for something. For him to invite them, or for something else. But Harold didn't want to think about what else that could be. The bus pulled up to the curb with a soft hiss of air as the doors opened. The driver didn't even look up, his face blank, as though he wasn't even aware of the fog that surrounded him, or the 2 children standing at the edge of the platform. Harold glanced at the children again. They hadn't moved an inch. Without saying another word, he stepped onto the bus and sat down, keeping his eyes forward, The two children followed. Harold's stomach tightened. He could feel them behind him, could almost sense them sitting down. The hairs on his neck stood up again, and he shifted in his seat, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The bus driver still hadn't acknowledged them, still hadn't said a word. It was as if he didn't even see the children at all. Harold turned slightly to glance at them. The boy was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, his black eyes fixed on him with that same unsettling stare. The girl was beside him, staring straight ahead, her pale face expressionless. And then, Harold realized something that made his blood run cold. The children weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the driver. Their eyes were still black, their faces still expressionless, but now the sense of something ancient, something wrong, hung in the air like a weight. They weren't supposed to be here, and neither, it seemed, was Harold. The fog outside pressed in closer, the world beyond the bus disappearing into the nothingness. The bus rumbled on, its wheels turning in time with the silence that stretched around them, thick and suffocating. And all Harold could do was watch as the world outside seemed to vanish. Story number 7. The New Neighbor. Samantha and Tom were excited. They'd spent months searching for the perfect house, and when they finally found it, it felt like a dream come true. The house was on the outskirts of town, a quaint little place with a big yard and plenty of space for the future they imagined. It was quiet here, far enough from the busy streets to feel peaceful, but close enough to the town center that they weren't isolated. They were eager to start fresh, build their life together, and make the house truly their own. The first few days were full of unpacking, sorting through boxes, and adjusting to the new space. The house creaked and groaned as old houses do, but it had character. There was something comforting about its worn wooden floors and the way the sun filtered through the trees in the yard. It felt like the perfect place to start their new chapter. But then, they started to notice something odd. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Samantha first saw them. She was in the kitchen, putting away the last of the dishes, when she looked out the window and saw two figures standing at the edge of the yard. Two children. They were just standing there, in the tall grass, watching her. Their faces were pale, unnaturally so, like they hadn't seen the sun in years. But it wasn't just their pale skin that struck her. It was their eyes. Black, empty, hollow. They didn't blink, didn't move. They just stared. Samantha's heart skipped a beat and she quickly pulled away from the window, telling herself it was nothing. Maybe they were just local kids playing around. It was a quiet neighborhood after all, and children had a tendency to wander, right? But even as she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that evening, Tom came home from work, and she told him about the children. Probably just some kids from the neighborhood, she said, brushing it off. We're on the outskirts of town. They might be curious about the new people moving in. Tom frowned, but didn't think much of it. You're probably right, he said, distracted by his own thoughts. He was tired from the long day and eager to relax. They carried on with their evening as usual. But over the next few days, it happened again. The children were always there, lurking just at the edge of the yard. Sometimes they were in the front, sometimes the back, but they never came too close. Always just standing, watching. It was as though they were waiting for something. Tom began to notice them too, but each time they were gone by the time he got close. They never seemed to speak or move, just those jet-black eyes following him, always from the shadows. At night, when he lay in bed, he would feel a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like someone was watching him, even though he knew the house was empty. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the yard darkened, Tom stepped outside to get some air. He had a strange feeling in his chest, an uneasy tightness that wouldn't go away. The yard was quiet, too quiet. He stood at the edge of the porch, scanning the tree line. He half expected to see the children again, standing there, still and silent. But this time, they were different. They weren't outside anymore. They were in the house. Tom froze as he saw them standing in the doorway of the living room. Their black eyes were fixed on him, just like before, but now they were inside, as if they had simply appeared out of nowhere. Their faces were just as pale, just as still. He blinked, trying to convince himself it was some trick of the light, but they didn't vanish. They didn't move. They were real. "Sam," he called, his voice shaky. "Sam, come here." Samantha came rushing into the room, her face pale as she saw the children standing there, in the middle of their home. They didn't speak, didn't ask for anything. They simply stared, their eyes unblinking. The room seemed to grow colder. The air grew heavy, like something was pressing down on them. "Who are you?" Samantha finally managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. The girl, taller than the boy, with long dark hair, tilted her head slightly. "We're just here," she said in a voice that sent a shiver down Samantha's spine. It wasn't a child's voice at all. It was older, darker. Tom stepped toward them, his heart pounding in his chest. "You need to leave." But they didn't move. They simply stood there, watching. It felt like time had stopped, like they were trapped in some strange moment, caught between reality and something else. Something sinister. The boy spoke next, his voice quiet but clear. "We'll be back." Samantha grabbed Tom's arm, her fingers trembling. "We need to get out of here," she said, fear rising in her chest. She was desperate to escape, to get away from the strange presence in their house. But when she turned to leave, the children were gone. Just like that. Tom and Samantha didn't speak for a long time after that. There were no more noises, no more sightings, but the feeling of being watched never went away. They kept the blinds shut, never opened the door after dark, and avoided the windows. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind made them jump. But it wasn't over. The children never left. They were always there, lurking just beyond the edges of their vision, waiting for the right moment, watching. And just when Samantha and Tom thought they might be free, when they thought they were safe, the children would appear again. Always with those black eyes, always waiting. Story number 8. Always watching. The crying in the woods. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, a break from the noise of the city, a chance to reconnect with nature. A group of friends, 3 guys and 2 girls, had packed up their gear and set out for a weekend camping trip deep in the woods. They were used to hiking, used to the outdoors, but this place was different. The woods were thick, darker than usual, with trees that seemed to bend over the trail like they were hiding something. Still, they didn't think much of it. It was just a forest, after all. They set up camp by a clearing, the sun starting to dip low, casting long shadows across the ground. Tom, the most enthusiastic about the trip, started the fire while Sarah and Jenny set up the tents. Mark and Chris, both more on the quiet side, wandered a little further down the trail, enjoying the peace that came with the isolation. It wasn't until after dinner, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, that they first heard it. A faint sound drifting on the wind. It started as a low whimper, then grew into a high-pitched sobbing. A child crying, desperate, as if lost and scared. The group stopped what they were doing, exchanging looks of confusion. There were no kids in the group. No one had seen any other campers around. "Is that?" Sarah began, but her voice trailed off. "Sounds like a kid, right?" Tom said, furrowing his brow. "But who the hell would be out here alone?" Mark stood up, looking toward the woods. The sound was distant, but it echoed through the trees, seeming to come from deeper in the forest. "I'll go check it out," he said, but no one moved. The idea of heading into the woods at night, even for a child, was unsettling. Still, something about the sound of that crying tugged at them. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, compelled them to go. "I'll go with you," Jenny said, standing up beside Mark. "We'll stick together." Tom and Chris exchanged uneasy glances but didn't argue. Sarah hesitated, but the thought of being alone by the fire was worse than the thought of investigating the crying. They all grabbed flashlights and started down the trail, the sobbing growing louder with each step. The woods around them felt heavier now, the trees close and crowded, the path narrowing as they ventured deeper. The air grew colder, though it was still summer. A chill crept under their skin, but they pressed on, their feet crunching over fallen leaves. Then, as if on cue, the sobbing stopped. Silence descended like a heavy curtain, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. "It's gone," Sarah whispered, her voice small. They all stopped, the hairs on the back of their necks standing up. For a moment, the world felt wrong. Unnaturally still, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Mark pushed forward, determined to find the source. "That was strange," Chris muttered. "Did anyone else feel that?" Before anyone could answer, they saw it. A figure. Two small figures standing by an old rotting tree. They were barely visible at first, blending into the dark trunks of the surrounding trees. But as they stepped forward, the flashlight beams caught them. Two children, maybe no older than 7 or 8, standing perfectly still, facing away from them. They were too still. Their clothes were old, tattered in places, as if they had been wearing them for years, and their faces were pale, almost sickly under the weak light. But it was their eyes that caught them. Pitch black. No whites, no color, just endless blackness, staring into the darkness. "What the hell?" Jenny gasped, her voice trembling. The children didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring ahead. Their crying was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, one of them, maybe the girl, turned her head slightly, her face still expressionless, and locked eyes with Mark. "Help us," the girl said, her voice like a cold wind. Without thinking, Mark started toward them. The others didn't follow right away. They stood frozen, unsure of what to do. But Mark felt compelled to approach, as if he couldn't stop himself. "Mark, don't," Sarah called, but it was too late. He was already moving closer to the children. They didn't run or scream. They simply turned and began walking deeper into the woods, slow but purposeful. Mark glanced back at the others, then followed them, unable to resist. It was like something in him had snapped, and all he could do was follow, follow, follow. "Mark, stop!" Jenny screamed, but he didn't hear her. His feet were moving on their own, each step carrying him further into the darkness. The others hesitated for only a second before following, fear clawing at their throats. The path grew narrower, the trees thicker. The air grew heavier, colder. It felt like the woods themselves were closing in around them, the darkness thickening as they moved deeper into the forest. The children led them down a winding path that seemed to have no end, the trees bending low over them, blocking out what little light was left. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sound of the children's footsteps was muffled by the thick undergrowth beneath them. And then, suddenly, they were there. In front of them stood an ancient stone structure, half sunken into the ground, covered in vines and rotting leaves. It looked like a forgotten altar, a place of sacrifice, older than anything they'd ever seen. The trees around it were twisted, their trunks gnarled and blackened, as if they had been burned from the inside out. The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. Mark stopped in his tracks, looking around with wide eyes. "What is this place?" he whispered, but no one answered. The children stood in front of the altar now, their faces still expressionless, their black eyes staring into the void. They were not children, not anymore. The air grew thick with fear, suffocating. The trees seemed to whisper, the shadows stretching toward them. "Get out!" Sarah whispered, her voice shaky with terror. But the ground beneath their feet had changed. The path was gone. The trees were closing in, their branches twisting and writhing like dark hands reaching for them. They were trapped. The children didn't move. They just watched, their black eyes never blinking, as the ancient evil in the woods stirred, awakening from its long slumber. It thrived on fear, and it could smell theirs now. And as the darkness closed in, all they could hear was the sound of the children's laughter, software cold, hollow. It echoed through the woods, and there was no escape. Story number 9. The phone call. It was just past 2 a.m. when the phone rang. Ethan Davis had been asleep for only a few hours. He had just started to drift into a deep, dreamless sleep when the shrill sound of the landline pierced the quiet of his dark bedroom. His eyes snapped open, his heart thudding in his chest. Who would be calling this late? He reached over to grab the phone, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. "Hello?" His voice came out groggy, confused. At first, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Ethan frowned, wondering if it was some wrong number or a prank call. He was about to hang up when a soft sob broke through the silence. It was the sound of a child crying, the kind of heart-wrenching sobs that made your chest tighten. "Hello?" Ethan said again, his voice a little sharper now. "Who is this?" The crying stopped, and a small trembling voice came through the line. "Help, please, I'm lost." Ethan's stomach clenched. "Who is this? Where are you? Are you okay?" The child's voice sounded distant, muffled by some kind of static. I don't know where I am. I'm scared." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "What's your name? Where are you?" But there was no answer. The line stayed silent, save for the soft, strained sobs that continued, echoing in the stillness of the night. Ethan jumped out of bed, his heart racing. He wasn't sure why, but something about the call felt wrong, like a nagging feeling deep in his gut. He fumbled for the phone, trying to trace the number. The old phone system wasn't great for tracing calls, but he was desperate to figure out who was on the other end. The digital screen flickered, and to his surprise, it wasn't a number he didn't recognize. No, the call was coming from his own house. His breath caught in his throat. What the hell? He glanced toward the hallway. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. His wife, Carla, was out of town for the night, visiting her sister. He was alone in the house, or so he thought. He glanced down at the phone again, then back toward the dark hallway. The sound of his own breathing seemed too loud in the stillness. There was a faint creak from downstairs, the floorboard shifting under a weight that shouldn't have been there. "Hello?" Ethan said into the phone again, his voice shaking. "Who's there?" This time, there was no sobbing, no crying. Just the sound of heavy breathing, like someone or something was on the other end, but not speaking. Then, before he could say anything else, the voice spoke again, low and almost a whisper. "Come find us." Ethan's blood ran cold. He didn't know what to make of it. Was this a prank? Some kind of twisted joke? He glanced around the room, looking at the shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls, but everything was still. Nothing moved. "Where are you?" he demanded, the fear creeping into his voice now. But the only answer was more silence. The line went dead. Ethan stood there for a moment staring at the phone, his heart thudding in his chest. He didn't know what to do. His first instinct was to check the house, to make sure everything was locked and safe. But he hesitated, fear gnawing at him. His feet felt like lead as he crept out of the room, down the hallway, and toward the stairs. The house was dark. Too dark. Every creak of the floor, every snap of the wood seemed amplified in the stillness. Ethan's breath came faster as he descended the stairs, the chill of the air making his skin prickle. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to explain the call. As he reached the living room, his eyes scanned the darkness. His mind kept telling him that there was nothing to be afraid of, that it was just a prank or a trick of his tired mind. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. And then he saw them. 2 small figures standing in the center of the living room. 2 children. They were motionless, their backs turned to him. He could barely make out their shapes in the darkness, but what struck him immediately was how wrong they seemed. The air grew colder, and he felt his chest tighten. The children turned slowly, almost in sync, their faces pale and void of expression. But it was their eyes that froze him in place. Their eyes were black, completely black, with no pupils, no whites, just empty, soulless voids staring back at him, as if they could see straight through him. Who are you?" Ethan's voice trembled, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from theirs. One of the children took a step forward, the other staying perfectly still. Their eyes never left him. "We've been waiting for you," the child said, the voice high-pitched and eerie, but hollow. Empty. Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears, the words sinking into him like ice water. The fear that had been creeping at the edges of his mind now took hold, suffocating him. What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The other child stepped forward as well, and now both of them were moving toward him. Ethan took a step back, but his legs were shaking so badly he couldn't move fast enough. The children were too close now, too close, their empty black eyes locked onto his, their faces too pale, too still. "We're lost," they said in unison, their voices blending into one. "We've always been lost." Before Ethan could speak, before he could scream or run, the air around him seemed to collapse inward, suffocating, pulling him deeper into the darkness. And as the children's black eyes bore into him, he realized that whatever had called him here, whatever had been waiting for him, had never been human. And there was no escaping it now. Story number 10. The Return. It had been 20 years since Peter Warren had left his childhood home. 20 years since he'd packed his things and fled, not just from the house, but from the terrifying memory of that night, the night he'd seen them, the black-eyed children. He hadn't wanted to return, but there was no other choice. His father had passed away, and the house was now his. It felt like fate pulling him back, whether he liked it or not. Peter had promised himself years ago that he'd never come back, that he'd never face the memories of that horrible night. But now, standing at the end of the long gravel driveway, he couldn't avoid it any longer. The house looked exactly the same as it had when he left, old, weathered, and covered in creeping ivy. It hadn't been maintained. The porch sagged in places, and the windows were cracked, like broken eyes staring back at him. But there was something else, something darker, deeper, lurking in the air around it. Peter parked the car and sat there for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The memory of those eyes, those terrible, empty eyes, flooded back, and his chest tightened with dread. He had never told anyone about that night, not even his wife. Who would believe him? But the truth was, he'd never fully let go of it, the black eyes, the way they watched him, the invitation that nearly destroyed him. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. His footsteps crunched on the gravel, the sound too loud in the heavy silence. The night was thick with fog, and a strange chill settled over him as he reached the porch. He glanced up, and that's when he saw them. Two figures standing on the porch, just as they had been that night. Two children. They were older now, their faces a little more defined, a little more mature, but their eyes, those eyes, were still the same. Black. Empty. There was no life in them, only darkness. Peter stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He had thought, maybe hoped, that they had been a product of his imagination, some kind of nightmare that had haunted him all these years. But they were real. They were standing there, waiting for him, as if no time had passed at all. The boy, the older one, stepped forward. His face was more angular now, his clothes a little more worn, but the eyes, they were the same, black, endless. "We've been waiting for you," the boy said, in a voice that sent a shiver through Peter. It was still the same voice, the same strange, calm tone that had haunted him all those years ago. Peter's heart raced, but he forced himself to take a step forward. "No," he said, his voice tight. "I'm not going inside. I know what you are." The girl, smaller but just as unnerving, tilted her head and smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It was colder, more knowing, as if she understood everything about him, every fear, every secret. "We only want to talk," she said softly, her voice like silk. But there was something in the way she said it that made Peter's skin crawl. "No," he repeated, his voice stronger this time. "I'm not a child anymore. I'm not scared of you." The boy stepped aside, his dark eyes never leaving Peter's. "You don't have to be scared," he said. "We just need a little help. Please, come inside." Peter's breath caught in his throat. That's what they had said the last time. Those exact same words. The last time, he had been just a teenager, and they had trapped him, forced him to invite them in. It had nearly cost him everything. "No," he said firmly. "You won't get me this time. You're not welcome here." The girl's smile faded, her black eyes narrowing, but she didn't move. She only stared at him, and for a moment, Peter could have sworn that the air around them grew colder, heavier. The boy didn't speak, but his presence was like a weight pressing down on Peter. "You can't stop us," he said, his voice soft but filled with an eerie certainty. "We're always here, always waiting." Peter felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The memories of that night, the fear, the darkness, the coldness that had seeped into his bones, rushed back with full force. He could feel it now, like a presence surrounding him, like the house itself was alive, waiting to pull him in, waiting to claim him once again. Peter's heart pounded, but this time he didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel and walked away from the porch, his legs shaking beneath him. He didn't look back, even though he could feel their eyes on him, following him, watching him. He could almost hear their voices calling to him, but he didn't listen. He reached the car and fumbled for his keys, his hands slick with sweat. The engine roared to life, and without a second thought, he threw the car into reverse and sped down the gravel driveway. As he drove away, the headlights cutting through the fog, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, still waiting for him, still watching. The darkness they carried with them was inescapable. He had thought he could face it. He had thought he could confront his past. But some things, some evil, didn't change. It only waited for you to come back. And now that he had, it would follow him. Always.